Hey guys, thanks for joining me. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I've been a pretty solid fan of the Pecron series of power stations and the sort of the bang for the buck that they give you. Well, they just announced their new F3000LFP power station, this guy right here. And in fact, I think you're taking pre-orders for it at the time that I'm doing this video. But let's talk about what this thing is and whether it might be a good fit for you. Okay, so right off the bat, this is a 3000 watt pure sine wave AC inverter. The specs say that it has the ability to surge to 4,500 watts, and you might think that's a little bit short for a 3,000 watt inverter, but that 4,500 watts is actually for 5 seconds. So I imagine you might get a little more like 6,000 watts for just maybe 100 milliseconds or something like that. But we'll kind of try to find out whether or not that's the case and whether or not this will run some fairly hungry power tools. So in addition to that 3,000 watt AC inverter, it's got 3,072 watt hours of capacity, and that is lithium iron phosphate. And in this case, it's rated for 3,500 full charge and discharge cycles, at which point it should still be retaining at least 80% or more of its original rated capacity. Now over here, I am charging this via solar right now, and it does have an XT60 input right here, and it is able to handle a minimum of 25 volts. So you have to be able to put 25 volts into it before it'll start charging up to 120 volts. And that total solar input is capped at 1,600 watts. Now on the AC charging port, which is right next to that, the max total AC charging rate is 1,800 watts, which is pretty typical for something like this. As you can see, it's got a TT30 or RV30 port right on here. Now because it's limited to 3,000 watts output, this is going to be a 25 amp max, not a 30 amp max, but it is a TT30 connector, and you have 5 20 amp 3-prong AC connectors right there, AC plugs. And then over here on this side, it's got a standard 12 volt 10 amp car socket. It's got a couple of DC 5521 accessory barrel connectors, and those are limited to 5 amps. And then in terms of USB, it's got one Type-C PD 100 watt port, and it's got 3 quick charge 18 watt ports right there. There does not appear to be any wireless charging. There does not appear to be any kind of an area light on there. There is on this side, and I'll give you a close-up of this, but there is a battery expansion port, and you can connect up to 2 of their 3,072 watt hour expansion batteries, and that would give you a total maximum expanded battery capacity on this unit of about 9.2 kilowatt hours. Now the F3000 does weigh in at a fairly hefty 63.3 pounds, but for something with over 3,000 watt hours of capacity, that is to be expected. In fact, it's on the lighter side of other units that I've seen with similar capacity. Now on the dimensions side, it is 19.3 inches wide here, including these little grab handles on the side. It is 11.6 inches deep, and it is 11.1 inches high. You can see we're charging on solar at just about 500 watts right now. It's not completely silent, but it is actually kind of cycling on and off. Now it is completely silent, so it's going to depend on your ambient temperature where you're charging this. But if it gets pretty warm where you're charging, the fans will kick on as they are right now. And I don't know if you can hear that, but it's just a very low volume whoosh. We'll get a sense for what the maximum volume is when we do the load testing. Now it does come with a little cable pouch that can be Velcroed to one of the grab handles on the side. And the pouch is just big enough to hold the 2 cables it comes with, the AC charging cable and the MC4 to XT60 solar charging cable. It does not come with a car charging cable. This is compatible with Pecron's DC to DC charger. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link to that in the description below so you can check that out. But that is pretty cool. This would allow you to charge this while you're running through your car alternator and battery combo to put up to about 500 watts into this unit while you're charging. Much better, much more efficient than trying to charge it off of a cigarette lighter plug. Now if you buy this and then register it on Pecron's website, they give you that what they call their 2+3 warranty, which is they're basically saying you get the extra 3 years if you register it on the website, and that is a 5-year warranty total, which is pretty good. Now in terms of price, I'm going to cover that at the end of the video when I have a little bit more definitive information on that. But the information I have right now is that the price on this thing is going to be eye-poppingly low. So stay tuned for that. All right, I think that's enough talk for now. Let's go ahead and get this thing on the bench. Well, it's already on the bench. Let's start putting this thing through the paces and see how it performs. All right, so I fully topped this off. You can see we're reading full now. I did that via solar just for fun. Save a little power on my part. So we're fully topped off. Let's do a DC discharge capacity test and find out how much usable capacity out of that rated 3072 we actually get pulling a low current or low amp draw here of 12 volts, 10 amps. So we'll do that with the car socket here. And if I turn on the DC, you can see up here we are reading 13.2 volts and I have it currently set to pull 10 amps. So let me get that started. And we will begin counting down. You can see this thing says we are pulling 137 watts. So it's going to be a pretty long time. We're estimating 21.4 hours. So we'll let this thing run all the way down till the BMS shuts us off, and we'll check tomorrow and find out how many watt hours we actually caught. All right, that was a long test. Looks like 21 hours. Let's just make sure we are fully depleted. And we are. So let me zoom in here and show you where we ended up. All right, as you can see, we got 2,677 watt hours out of that 3,072 rated watt hours. So that is a very respectable number. That's about 87% of rated, which would put this slightly above average. And I'm a little surprised the numbers are that high, given the fact that this had to run for 21 plus hours. So very good numbers on the DC usable capacity. All right, while we're charging up this F3000, let me go ahead and pull up the mobile app for you. So I've got multiple Pecron units in my mobile app. Let me go ahead and tap the tile for the F3000. And you can see we are getting 4% and we're currently inputting 1,622 watts, which matches what we're seeing on the display. So I can turn on the AC and the DC outputs here. You can hear the little confirmation beeps. All right, so all the standard stuff. And if I go into the little bolt icon in the upper right-hand corner to get into settings, I can rename the unit, I can share it with other users. I'm not sure what anti-miss operation mode is. I have to see if I can figure out what that is. All right, so I can change the key brightness on these little keys here. So let me try it at 10%. Yeah, so it dims the lights on those buttons, which might be handy if you're using this at night and you are annoyed by bright little lights. Put those back to 100%. So with eco mode enabled, I assume that means that the device will time out at some period, but there's also a standby option down here, as you can see, which is currently set to 30 minutes. So I'm not sure what the difference between those two is. I'll have to look at the user manual, see if I can figure that out. But you can see under standby mode, you have an option to set it to 30-minute timeout, 2 hour, 6 hour, 24 hour, even a week. All right, so you can see I got charging speed currently set to 20%. That is equating to about 346 watts. And by the way, that's kind of hard to see. I've got automatically dim when idle turned on. So let me disable that so that display gets a lot brighter. I mean, obviously that consumes a little bit more battery power, but who cares? This is a 3,000 watt hour power station. It's not enough to really worry about. So yeah, if I wanted to bump up that charging speed to charge it faster, then I can certainly do that from the app. But if I'm not in a hurry, charging at this slower rate, as long as I've got the time, puts the least amount of stress on the battery cells, which would ultimately give you the longest overall service life for the battery cells. So I always suggest charging at the slowest rate you're comfortable with. I think in the end, it doesn't make a huge difference typically, unless you are constantly charging at max rate every day, multiple times. In that case, I think you would see a faster degradation of the internal cell, battery cell life. So just something to think about. Then if I scroll down here a little bit more, you can also update the firmware from here. If you don't like the beep sound when you press the buttons, for example, you can turn that off. It says buzzer volume. It's not really a buzzer, it's more of a beep. And then now you don't hear the beep. So yeah, pretty straightforward. All the essential functions in the Pecron mobile app. All right, I've got the F3000LFP fully charged. Let's just double check that. 100%. All right, let's go ahead and turn on the AC inverter and let's do a usable capacity test through the AC inverter and find out how much of that 3,072 rated watt hours we actually get. So I'm going to put a load on this of about 600 watts. And there we are, 602 watts out of the watt meter. Internally, we're reading 584, and we are counting up the watt hours. So we'll let this run all the way until the BMS shuts us down, and then we'll take a look at how many watt hours we actually got. All right, it looks like our AC discharge test is done. Let's plug in the watt meter and see how we did. Make sure we're at 0. Yep, 0% state of charge. Wow, that is a very good number. We got 2,880 watt hours out of that rated 3,072, and that is just shy of 94%, so 93.75%. Man, that is one of the best numbers I've seen. So excellent, excellent inverter numbers or usable capacity numbers out of this F3000LFP. All right, let's do a load test on this F3000 with its rated 3,600 watt inverter. And we are currently pulling, if I zoom in there a little bit for you, 3,527 watts. So I'm going to flip one more load over there, and I am using the TT30 here output to connect to my manual transfer switch. Let me go ahead and flip another load over there so we can get that going and see if we can get a little closer to 3,600 watts. There we go. Now we just crossed over. Let's see if we can get away with just a hair overrated for 10 full minutes. All right, so we were actually between 3,650 and almost, at one point we hit 3,700 watts for that full 10-minute interval here. So in terms of load testing to that 3,600 watt spec, that is a definite pass. Let's see if we can find out where this thing will trip. All right, let's try adding another 100 watts. We're already 68 watts over the rated value, and we tripped it. So not a lot of overhead here. All right, so I power cycled the unit, turned the AC inverter back on after removing some load, and you can see we are now using the AC inverter once again at about 1,200 watts. So not really any overhead other than the 70 or maybe 100 watts that we saw, but that's actually pretty decent. But you do want this thing to shut off appropriately when it's being overloaded, and that is what it does. So again, AC load test, definite pass. All right, let's do a solar test on this. And specifically, we want to do a wake and charge test. So I've got this thing all the way run down. If I try to turn this on, yeah, it is completely down. So I'm curious if we apply a solar connection, if this thing will wake up. Now it is about 8 o'clock at night, and there may be enough ambient light to wake this thing up, although it's not looking like it. But what I want to find out is if this will wake up on its own in the morning and start charging on its own without me having to wake it up, turn it on, unplug, replug, or anything like that. So completely unattended wake and charge is what we're hoping for. Now, as I said in the intro, this will take a maximum of 1,600 watts of solar. And that's sufficient solar if you max this thing out to fully charge this thing in something like 2 hours or less. So that's a pretty generous solar spec for this particular power station. And the voltage range for that is 25 volts up to 120 volts. So you want to make sure you have at least 25 volts. Now I think I've got this currently set up in a 2S2P configuration with 4 200 watt panels, which means I'm going to have something like 38 or 40 volts is all I've got in this right now. That should be enough to get it charging once I have some sun on the panels. So we will check back in the morning and see how this thing is doing and whether or not I have to do anything to wake it up. All right, it is about 8 o'clock in the morning and we are charging at a very modest 37 watts, but we're already up to 3%. The sun is not directly on the panels yet, so that's going to ramp up pretty quickly. I'm kind of surprised we're at 3%. With only 37 watts going in. But yeah, so I'm going to let this thing charge throughout the rest of the day and just see how we do with 800 watts of solar. But at least for the wake and charge test, definite pass. All right, real quick, it is, let's see here, 6:02 p.m. And much to my surprise, with 800 watts connected, we are almost fully charged. In fact, if I just let it go, since we're down to only 120 watts because the sun is not set, but it's definitely not aligned with the panels. But I imagine we would fully top this off, which, like I said, a little bit surprising. But yeah, definitely works. And since it does have a max solar input of 1600 watts, if you actually max this out, you could easily top this thing off in probably less than half of a day of good sun conditions. Let's go ahead and find out how noisy or not the AC output is from this AC inverter, so we know whether or not this would be a suitable choice if you wanted to do something like run a ham radio or a PA system or guitar amp. So I got my old guitar amp here with no noise suppression, no nothing here. It's this very old guitar amp. Let's listen to what it sounds like on clean grid power so we have a good baseline comparison. So here we go. This is grid power. All right, so now let me unplug it and plug it into the AC inverter, and we'll see if it sounds any different. All right, so now we got it plugged in with the inverter on. Let's find out if it sounds any different. All right, so yeah, there is definitely more noise coming out of the AC inverter than there is on our baseline grid power. So this would probably not be a suitable use case for this particular unit in order to power something like a guitar amp or a remote PA system, unless those devices have pretty good noise suppression on them. The other way that you would get around that, obviously, is if you had a line conditioner. But short of that, with no line conditioner, I wouldn't use this for remote amplification purposes. So just be aware of that. All right, let's find out how this F3000 does with power tools, because that's a pretty common use case, I think, for a lot of you. So we're gonna see if it'll run my shop vac, my small compressor, and also my 12-inch Hercules miter saw. All right, got the AC inverter turned on. Let's go ahead and start with the shop vac and see how we do. So no problem there. Let's try the air compressor. This is actually not nearly as big a load as a shop vac. This is only pulling 637 watts. It probably has an inrush current of like, I don't know, 1500 or 1800 watts max. So no problem with that. Let's try the compound miter saw. This is usually the thing that determines whether this is going to run anything else in my shop, because this is the biggest inrush current of all the power tools I have. All right, looks like we peaked, at least on the display, at about 2500, and then it jumped down to about, what was it, 1800 or something like that. But yeah, no problem running that 12-inch compound miter saw. So my curiosity though is, will it run the compressor? Can I have that running in the background and run the miter saw at the same time? Let's see if that'll work. I'm a little less confident about this one. All right, we're at 761 watts with just the compressor. There we go. Yep, it did it. Cool. All right, let's do a quick UPS test on this F3000. I got my gaming PC and the monitor hooked up here through a surge suppressor, and then I've got grid power coming in through the front right next to that over here on the left. So we're going to simulate a power outage and see if my PC shuts down or reboots at all. So let's do that real quick, and then we'll see if it works in reverse. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. And look on the display here, you can see we're no longer inputting any power, but we are outputting 449 watts. So far that was an absolute pass. Let's see if it works in reverse, and we'll reestablish grid power pass-through. So here we go. Heard the relay, no blips on the screen, and we're now inputting just about 400 watts while we're outputting the same, or similar. So, UPS mode on this F3000, definite pass. All right, so some excellent performance numbers from this new F3000LFP, especially that usable capacity result that we got through the AC inverter. I think really the only real caution that I would have on this power station is if you were looking to use the power station as a portable power source for amplification purposes, since it does seem to inject a fair amount of noise into a guitar amp, I probably wouldn't use it for that. So aside from that though, this F3000LFP is actually a standout performer. And a couple of other things to mention. I did test the no-load draw on the AC inverter, and it does seem to consume about 1.2% of the overall state of charge per hour, which would equate to about 36 watts continuous. And while that's not the lowest number I've seen, it's definitely a reasonable number for a 3600 watt AC inverter. Now, I also did test those DC 5525 ports in case you were curious about that, and they are indeed capped at 5 amps. They won't pull any more than that. And it does appear that the combined current limit on both of those particular ports and the car socket is a maximum of 10 amps. So you can't pull the maximum current on all 3 ports at the same time. And then just as an observation, I thought it might be worth mentioning that I did notice that when you turn on the AC inverter, it takes about 10 seconds after that beep before you actually hear the relay click and the outlets begin supplying power. So not a big deal, obviously, but the first time you turn it on, you might initially think that something is wrong, but that's actually just normal behavior for this unit. So I think I previously mentioned that the battery expansion port on the side of the unit, it's basically an XT120 port, and that does allow you to connect up to 2 of Pecron's 48 volt, 3072 watt hour expansion modules. And that means that the max expanded capacity for this entire system would be 9.2 kilowatt hours, which would be a solid spec if you wanted to use something like this to keep, your critical circuits backed up in the event of a power outage. And if you did max out the battery expansion to that 9.2 kilowatts, that 1600 watts of solar input max should enable you to top this back off from about 10 or 15% back up to 100% in a full day of decent sun conditions. And if you wanted to, say, ensure that you had 0 to 100% charging, keep in mind that those Pecron expansion batteries can be solar charged independently with up to 400 watts of solar on their own. And that's a pretty nice spec considering that most expansion battery modules can only be charged from their main power station and they can't be charged by themselves. So I wish more brands would actually follow Pecron's lead on that particular point. So now the big question, how much does this new F3000LFP cost? Well, I've got some good news for you. Like pretty much all of the other power stations in Pecron's continually expanding lineup, this new F3000 is currently selling at an eye-poppingly low 32 cents per watt hour, at least during this introductory period. And that equates to $999, which is really actually a fantastic deal on a solidly built power station with a 3600 watt inverter and over 3000 watts of capacity. And as far as I'm aware, this is probably the best deal going right now for a power station in this class. I'd probably go even so far as to say that it would be very difficult to DIY something with these kinds of specs at a lower price. And whatever DIY configuration you'd end up with would no doubt be nowhere near as compact and portable as this is. So I think if you're in the market for something that gives you, the most utility that you can get at the lowest price currently available while still maintaining something resembling true portability to the extent that that's possible at 63 pounds, well, I don't know what else would come even close to this F3000LFP in checking all of those boxes. All right, I think that's a wrap. If you have any remaining questions on this F3000 that I didn't already answer for you, feel free to leave those in the comments section below, and I'll do my best trying to answer them for you. I do hope you found something in the video informative or useful in some way, and if you did, I'd very much appreciate it if you'd be so kind as to click on that like button down below for me. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll come back soon and join me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.